Hello, welcome to the Roundtable. This week is the fourth segment of a New Year's special for the Roundtable in the year 2024, the year of the Blue Dragon. We are back with two experts who will share their insightful analysis and expertise on global affairs. First, we have Dr. Lee Kyung-seok, professor of Incheon National University, with us today. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And like the last week, we are joined by Dr. Kim Hena of Sogang University. Welcome.
Thanks for having me again. I'm excited to talk about some interesting events today.
Like what?
Dr. Wong, what was the biggest news that stood out for you last week?
Last week, of course, that's the declaration by Supreme Leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, that North Korea would no longer consider South Korea as a part of the reunification of two Koreas, and the reunification will be deleted in the Constitution of North Korea, and South Korea is now defined as a primary enemy to North Korea. Very harsh criticism and bold statements.
It's quite bold.
Yeah, I agree. I also closely followed the recent news, and I look at the news related to Kim Jong-un's recent remarks, and there's a really alarming expressions. For example, like South Korea is the #1 hostile state, and there's a war or like a territorial occupations. And many experts really express the concerns about the current security environment on the Korean Peninsula. And I think it's a really important topic we will cover today.
I see. Kim Jong-un recently labeled South Korea as a main enemy. First, Kim, for our viewers' information, would you give us more details about actual remarks made by Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, I think you also already mentioned some of them already, but he made several key remarks. First, he called for defining the Republic of Korea as the primary enemy in the Constitution. He also called for deleting terms that would refer to South Koreans as having the same nationality as those of North Koreans. And he also called for abolishing agencies that deal with inter-Korean relations and also denounced the Northern Limit Line. And I think the final key remark that really stood out was that he called for the occupation of South Korean territory. So that also stood out as well.
Yeah, that's a very scathing threat and unexpected remarks he made at the Supreme People's Assembly and in other occasions. But this is not the first time that the North Korean government made a serious threat to South Korea. So why do we need to take it more seriously this time?
So we have to understand the background, especially from the change from the Moon administration to the Yoon administration.
Previous South Korean government.
Exactly, right. And also the fiasco of the Hanoi summit. So the Hanoi summit was a tipping point and the inflection point for Kim Jong-un's foreign policies. And after that, he realized that the denuclearization talk with United States and South Korea is impossible. So after that, Kim Jong-un shifted its foreign policy more hawkish way. And in line with this hawkish kind of policy standpoint, North Korea has significantly developed the nuclear and missile capabilities. So based on this confidence about his North Korea's nuclear muscles, North Korean Kim Jong-un is trying to be more provocative and belligerent against South Korea and the United States allies in the region.
The Korean War took place in 1950 to 1953, many years ago. And the Korean Peninsula has been a very interesting situation. Legally speaking, we are still in the state of war because the Korean War has not formally ended with a peace treaty, but only stopped with the armistice agreement signed in July 1953. But in reality, two Koreas have been living in a very unstable but somehow manageable status quo. So are we going back to the period prior to the 1953 armistice agreement?
So I would say going back to the situation before the 1953 armistice treaty, it's a little bit too exaggerated. But I think so we're going back to the security situation before the 2018 Pyeongchang Olympics. So recall in 2017. So 2017 is a really important year when North Korea conducted the 6th nuclear test. And also test fire intercontinental ballistic missile, for example, Hwasong-14 and Hwasong-15. So these, in 2017, I vividly remembers many experts anticipated a possible war on the Korean Peninsula. As evidence, actually, United States deployed 2 aircraft carriers in the East Sea and tried to figure out a strategic preemptive strike against North Korea. So I think these security situation is quite similar to 2017 situation rather than the situation before the domestic treaties.
If we extend this scenario a little bit longer than Professor Kim and Professor Lee, are we going into the same strategic environment to 2017 and 2018, meaning that Kim Jong-un intentionally increases the security tension on the Korean Peninsula by threatening possible war in the Korean Peninsula and waiting for the United States president to respond in the following year with the olive branch that we remember that in 2018, suddenly he became so peaceful, making a New Year's message to the nation and to South Korea that we would like to congratulate South Korea hosting the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games. We're going to send our delegations and all kinds of help, and we are open to have a dialogue with the US president. And voila, there was a summit meeting between US president and North Korean leader for the first time in history. Is North Korea intending to run the same strategic cycle? What do you think?
If we're considering the same strategic cycle, if kind of on a broader level, if you're asking about whether or not the two Koreas are potentially going to go to war again, a lot of people are concerned about that possibility right now. For example, Robert Gallucci, who was the chief U.S. negotiator with North Korea during the nuclear crisis in 1994, he recently stated that we have to entertain the possibility that a war can break out in the Korean Peninsula this year. Right? So that's a little concerning, especially if a lot of people seem to think about it in this way. But in my personal opinion, I don't think North Korea is going to proactively initiate a war anytime soon. Kim Jong-un has mentioned that enemy does not bother them. They're not going to unilaterally initiate a war. So if we were to take that into context, I don't see it happening in the near future.
I see. That's good news.
I also read Professor Gallucci's and Professor Hacker's articles, and these two experts, they are the really Korean specialists. But I think their argument about the possibility of a nuclear war in 2024, it's a little bit misleading and a little bit less compelling to me at least. So in terms of the rationale, my main question is, what is the stakes for North Korea, for Kim Jong-un, conducting a full-scale war?
Going all the way to the extreme.
Yes, exactly. I agree that the military tension has escalated, but I don't think Kim Jong-un will actually determine a full-scale war. But it's possible that Kim Jong-un will conduct a local provocation because South Korean election is in April, and there's a presidential election in the United States.
I think there are two possibilities for Kim Jong-un making such extreme remarks. One is, like his grandfather who initiated the Korean War in 1950, he is really determined to use the military force to make a last hurrah, to reverse the trend on the Korean Peninsula to the favor of North Korea. It's a huge risk, but it was done by his grandfather. And some foreign experts actually remain open to that extreme possibility. The second possibility is that Kim Jong-un is intentionally escalating the tension on the Korean Peninsula as a means to increase his bargaining leverage upon upcoming high-level negotiations with South Korea and the United States after the presidential election of the United States will be over in November. North Korea is hoping the return of Donald Trump so that there will be redo of the Singapore and Hanoi summit meeting with the United States. So we have to be open to these two possibilities to look into the real intentions of Kim Jong-un making all these unprecedented remarks. And in South Korea, people are really concerned about this talk of war.
Yeah, I agree that this is becoming a point of concern. Even when I speak to my international students at my university, they show a lot of concern about North Korea's provocations. But I think there's a bit of a discrepancy between how the international community views North Korea compared to how South Koreans view North Korea. And we definitely see this in a comparison of neighboring countries as well. So a recent survey actually showed that around 73% of people in Japan viewed North Korea as a primary threat, whereas 65% of people in South Korea viewed North Korea as a primary threat. So there's definitely a discrepancy, and part of this might be because people in South Korea they've heard these provocations over and over again. So to a certain extent, they're just overly accumulated to this, whereas the international community is a bit more perplexed by North Korea's aggressive rhetoric. So I think in that sense, many people want to know why, if North Korea may not really mean it, why is North Korea amping up its aggressive rhetoric towards the United States and to South Korea, and why this has started since late last year?
That's a very interesting question, and I gave my thought about it. And my guess is that the North Korean leadership is in a rock and hard place, dealing with growing challenges and crises inside North Korea. Because those harsher remarks towards South Korea and the United States made by Kim Jong-un this time are made in a very conditional phrases. If the outside forces attempt to throw us over, or if we continue to receive the toxic elements of capitalism and South Korean culture, then we're gonna take our own measures. That shows the concerns and fear inside North Korean regime about the influence of South Korea as a successful example in regime competition between North Korea and South Korea. So by abandoning the policy and rhetoric of reunification of two Koreas, North Korean leadership is desperate in trying to curb the agitated and the suffering population to be further gravitated toward a fluent and influential South Korea, right? We're gonna go our separate ways. So do not expect us to be join hands with South Korea in receiving the benefits, right? You have to stay unified under the leadership of the North Korean Workers' Party. I think that's the essence of the message delivered by the leadership of North Korea. In George Orwell's novel, 1984, he said that the goal of war is not victory. The goal of war is to continue. As long as North Korean leadership succeeds in persuading population that the war is imminent with South Korea and the United States, it will help justify the dictatorship forever, despite economic difficulties and whatnot. Personally, I'd like to hear your thoughts about what North Korean leadership is trying to achieve in the short term. I think it is a kind of a known secret that North Korea's provocations aim at influencing the outcomes of the National Assembly election in South Korea that will be held in April.
Yes, definitely. I think there's a true intentions that Kim Jong-un is calculating right now. In general, I think the South Korean publics are really concerned about the actual military clashes. So I don't think that just a military provocation from North Korea will change South Korean people's voting behaviors. But if there are casualties resulted from an actual military clash between South Korea and North Korea, that will change South Koreans' voting behaviors. So I want to really make it clear the effect of North Korea provocation should be differentiated between a clash that includes civilian casualties or military casualties, or just a military provocation without any casualties. If a casualty occurs, it will actually change people's mindset about North Korea, and it will change their voting behaviors.
In the past, this often used to fall along partisan lines, right? The North Korean issue, when there was an intensification of the North Korean threat, it worked to the advantage of the Conservative Party. But now things aren't so black and white anymore, and the mechanism doesn't work in that way. So if there are no casualties, as Professor Lee mentioned, I think that when it comes to interest in North Korea in terms of its provocations, we have to break this down demographically. So a recent survey by the Korean Institute for National Unification actually showed that younger people are increasingly less interested in North Korea and North Korea's provocations, whereas for older people, it continues to still remain a core issue in politics. And the same survey actually showed that male respondents were more likely to still be interested in North Korea, more so than female respondents. So I think it'll have an impact on the presidential elections as well, but we're going to have to look at it based on demographics and by different groups rather than just along partisan lines.
I see.
So breaking down, disaggregating the South Korean public based on the demographic, especially from the age, I want to point out the younger generation especially, they're more hawkish than we expected. So if the actual military conflict occurs that includes casualties, then the younger generations are more likely to vote a party that have a more hawkish standpoint against North Korea, and this is actually will have a huge impact on the in the elections.
And North Korea's strategy may backfire. Right?
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting. After heightening tensions on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea turned to Russia. Last week, North Korea Foreign Minister Choi Sun-hee visited Russia and met with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Her visit has further fueled allegations of arms deals between Pyongyang and Moscow. First, Kim, what is the reason for the Russia and North Korea getting closer and closer, despite the fact that both countries are suffering from deeper international isolation?
I think it's actually very clear why they're becoming closer. And as you mentioned, both countries are quite isolated. And so historically, the two countries have had a relatively good diplomatic relationship. But in the case of Russia, for example, since the start of the Ukraine war, Russia has found itself more and more isolated. And in the case of North Korea, not only are there more sanctions, but North Korea continues to develop its nuclear technology, which is isolating itself even further. So for their own survival, being isolated in the international community is not working to their advantage. So by default, they probably want to keep an alliance that'll help where they can help each other. So the question
has the answer in itself,
right?
Okay. Professor Lee, if there will be a summit meeting actualized in Pyongyang by President Vladimir Putin's visit to Pyongyang, then what will be agreed between the two countries?
Putin's visit to Pyongyang will be really important for North Korea's military capability development, I mean. So right now, North Korea is the most important and strategic partner for Russia. And China is really reluctant to intervene Russia's war in Ukraine. So as a trade-off, and I definitely think Kim Jong-un knows his strategic positions. So Kim Jong-un's as a summit between Putin, he will get the high technology, especially the nuclear submarine technologies, and also the ballistic missiles as a trade-off to supporting Putin's war in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, Professor Lee, I have a slightly different opinion about the possibility because, in my personal opinion, the price does not match, right? In exchange for importing artillery shells and conventional rockets from North Korea, Russia providing North Korea most advanced weapon technologies, including nuclear submarines and ICBMs, the price does not match.
But in terms of the bargaining perspective, so Kim Jong-un can push forward the front line and then push back to get what he wants. And at the end, North Korea needs the high technology, especially nuclear submarines technologies, or advanced jet fighters technologies.
So if the President Putin is going to make a state visit to Pyongyang, then it's going to be a really tough negotiation on both sides, right?
Yes.
Okay.
But I think it's a really strategic opportunity for North Korea because he knows that Putin's need North Korea.
Another point I'd like to add here is that concerning our dear friends living in South Korea worrying about the war in the Korean Peninsula, I am inclined to agree with Mr. Tae Yong-ho, former diplomat of North Korea who defected to South Korea and became the member of National Assembly, that it is very unlikely for North Korea to have the capacity to have a major invasion of South Korea, considering North Korea is busy providing and selling all the artillery shells and weapons to Russia. Without weapons, North Korea does not have the capability to initiate another Korean war on the Korean Peninsula. So there is a silver lining in the current situation on the Korean Peninsula. You have to have a weapon to initiate a war, and North Korea does not have weapons to consume. Of course, there are more players with a huge stakes in the stable international environment of the Korean Peninsula and the Asia-Pacific region than the United States and North Korea. South Korea cannot be just standing in the sideline with its arms folded. So what would be the best strategic advice you have for South Korea, especially its government?
So this is a really tricky question.
And South Korean government wants to hear from you.
Right, to be honest, so under the Yoon administrations and under the Biden administration, I don't think we have a really best strategic diplomatic approach. Because you have to think about it, why the Yoon government was so hawkish against North Korea. So Yoon government has observed the fiasco of Hanoi summits, and they realized a diplomatic approach to denuclearize North Korea it's illusions. So that's the turning point why the current Yoon high officials are thinking the hawkish line and the aggressive line, it's more, it's the right way to deal with North Korea. So in the near future, I don't think there's a good options to solve these issues diplomatically. But I think one option is possible, using China as a big brother to move Kim Jong-un. Because from the Chinese perspective, any kind of real military contingency on the Korean Peninsula, it's not helpful for Chinese security and economy. So using China, improve the Korea-China relations, and then use China to press, to have a pressure to Kim Jong-un, then it's more like a strategic way to ease the military tension on the Korean Peninsula.
Just to add 2 cents onto what Professor Lee said, I think this comes on the premise that North Korea needs, or the international community, including South Korea, needs to send a message to North Korea showing that bad behavior will not be compensated. And this works under the premise that if North Korea continues these threats, the international community needs to show North Korea that this is not going to work in your favor. These threats are not, we're not taking them very seriously. So I think that comes with what Professor Lee had mentioned.
Interestingly, Biden administration, in response to the harsh remarks by Kim Jong-un recently, North Korea has to come back to diplomacy. So are we getting closer to the resumption of talks and dialogues between Washington and Pyongyang?
I don't know. So so this is why the presidential election in the United States is so important. So I'm quite skeptical that the Yoon government will just switch its foreign policy stance to North Korea and come to the negotiation table and resume the talk with North Korea. But the momentum comes may be able to come from Washington. If the next president of the United States want to have a more a engagement policy rather than a containment policies, then South Korea, the Yoon government to some degree, has to align to the Washington's leaders' decisions. So at that point, we have to think about a more a diplomatic or negotiational approach to deal with the North Korea's issues.
Kind of adding on to that, I think one thing that the South Korea can do is to remain consistent in its foreign policy towards North Korea. Every time the administration changes, the policy changes as well. And this is sending mixed signals to North Korea, but also North Korea can take advantage of these switches. But if South Korea remains consistent in its foreign policy, regardless of which administration is in power, I think that would work in our favor.
So it's really important to hold the positions. And there's I'm keep emphasizing about military conflict that include a military casualty or not. So heightening military tensions and an actual war is different. So right now the situation is there's no military conflict. So we have to think about it. What is from the long-term perspective? If the current Yoon government hold a consistent policy standpoint towards North Korea, then it could signal a bold message to
and the resolve
to North Korea.
I see. Well, it's very difficult to deal with such heavy topics for the interest of not only South Koreans but the global citizens around the world. But we have to deal with tough questions as experts to benefit the entire world. One thing I remind myself is that North Korea alone cannot make such a huge strategic decision, including all the military action against South Korea, despite its harsh rhetorics, because the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 would not have become possible without Soviet Union giving the green light to Kim Il-sung at that time. So if we apply the lesson of history to current situation we are facing, then without China, Russia backing North Korea, then such a nightmare scenario may not be easily materialized. So there's a element of hope there. Over the past 4 weeks, we have discussed a variety of regional and global affairs in our special New Year series. I hope you have found it informative and useful. We'll be back next week with more interesting issues. Professor Lee and Professor Kim, thank you so much for joining our program and share your insights with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.